Today, I want to delve into IVDR classification for software and use specific examples to provide you a clearer understanding of this sometimes intricate topic. Just a few words about myself. I am a senior quality and regulatory consultant with Quaregia. My background is in molecular immunology, and after having spent 14 years at the bench, I have held several positions in startups in Vienna, where I was involved in quality and regulatory affairs and mostly placing of products on the market under the IVDR. Very briefly, what we do at Quaregia is that we offer quality and regulatory affairs consulting services for a variety of products with a focus on medical device software, cybersecurity, and artificial intelligence. Today's agenda is set up with the aim to prevent you from getting a severe headache every time you try to decode IVDR software classification. So in order to do that, I would go into the following topics. So I will discuss the qualification of IVD-MDSV, which for the entirety of the talk stands for In Vitro Diagnostic Device Medical Device Software. I will then discuss classification of IVD-MDSV with examples of when the software is standalone, embedded, or has multiple functionalities. I will then discuss what type of changes impact classification and how can this be addressed. And I will touch a little bit upon challenges that are brought by AI and ML containing software. But to start with, to understand what IVD-MDSV is, we really have to start from the definition of an in vitro diagnostic medical device. According to the IVDR, this is any medical device that can be a reagent, product, calibrator, instrument, apparatus, software, or system, whether used alone or in combination, that is intended by the manufacturer to be used in vitro for the examination of specimens, including blood and tissue donations. These specimens are derived from the human body, and the main purpose of this examination is to provide information for a variety of setups, such as concerning a physiological or pathological state, physical or mental impairments, predisposition to diseases, etc. What is important to remember here is that any IVD is intended for the examination of specimens, which means no specimen, no IVD. So, including blood and tissue donations that are derived from the human body. So this means that the IVD itself does not touch the body, it only touches the specimen that is derived from the human body and is used for the purpose of providing information, meaning it never goes back into the body. Just to give you a very mundane example, a dialysis machine would not be an IVD, but would be a medical device because the blood would go back into the body. What we understand by specimen, for those who are more software oriented, is any type of sample from the body, like blood, tissue, or urine. So this definition is important to keep in mind when we ask the question, what is IVD-MDSV? Because IVD medical device software is defined as software that is intended to be used for a purpose as specified in the definition of in vitro diagnostic device in the IVDR, as we just saw. So any software that is performing functions within this definition is an IVD-MDSV, and I will explain a little bit more of how this can be decided. What is important to know at this point is that software that is driving or influencing the use of an in vitro diagnostic device can be either a part component of the device or can be classified or qualified as an accessory for the medical device. And for this, we just quickly look at what an accessory is, and then we go into more practical examples. So an accessory is an article which, while not being itself an in vitro diagnostic device, is intended to be used together with the in vitro diagnostic device to specifically enable the IVDs to be used in accordance with its intended purpose or to assist the medical functionality of the IVD. So accessories do not have a medical purpose on themselves. They just assist the functionality of an IVD. As I said, this is all very theoretical. So when it comes to really qualification of IVD and DSV, I have tried to make it simple and come up with a mnemonic that I call mapping IVD MDSV, so MAP. And this basically summarizes the 3 musts that a software must comply with in order to be qualified as a medical device, in vitro diagnostic device. So the M stands for medical purpose or provide information, as we saw in the definition. And in the case of IVDs, this medical purpose or information provided has to be based on data obtained by IVD medical devices only, or the intended purpose must be substantially driven by IVD data sources. So the software can analyze data that comes from either IVD devices, but its medical purpose has to be within the scope of the in vitro diagnostic regulation. The A stands for the software must perform an action on data that is different from storage, archival, communication, or simple search. And finally, the P stands for patient, because whatever the action on data that the software is performing has to be for the benefit of individual patients. So this, for the qualification of IVD MDSV, I always like to apply this MAP mnemonic, and I have prepared several examples to go through to show you how this can be done in practice. So I have listed here several types of software, which will be colored in green if they are IVD MDSV, in red if they are not IVD MDSVs, and in blue if they would be an accessory to an IVD. So for example, the first example, electronic health record systems, would not be considered an IVD MDSV because they would not perform an action on data that is different from storage, archival, communication, or simple search. So the A in MAP. A calibration software for IVD devices would be an accessory because the software would not have a medical purpose in itself, but it would assist the functionality of an IVD. Whereas, for example, a PCR data analysis software would be considered a medical device, an IVD medical device software, because it has a medical purpose. It performs an action on data that is different from storage, archival, communication, or simple search, and it is for the benefit of individual patients. So it fulfills all the 3 MAP criteria. And for exercise coaching apps for physical therapy would not be considered IVD MDSV because they provide general well-being information and are not really for the benefit of individual patients, meaning they could be used irrespective of the patient's health status. A blood glucose monitoring software, like in the previous example, will conform with all 3 criteria of the MAP. So if they would have a medical purpose, they would perform an action on data that is different from storage or simple search, and they would be for the benefit of individual patients. Whereas finally, a software for data transfer between IVD devices would be considered an accessory because it does not have a medical purpose on itself, but it supports the functionality of the medical device software. I want to now illustrate this with a bit more complicated example, because sometimes softwares we encounter in real life are not as simple as having just one functionality. So for this, I would take as an example of a software that would serve as a clinical decision support for physicians to determine the patient's likelihood of cardiovascular artery disease. So this would be an AI model that would calculate the patient's likelihood or score the likelihood of cardiovascular artery disease. In order to run this algorithm, 32 variables are used as an input, and they come from the following sources. For example, there would be 14 non-medical device, non-IVD sources that would provide information about the patient's history, like is the patient a smoker. There would be elements of physical examination from three medical device sources, like blood pressure. So blood pressure is measured with a medical device. And then there would be 15 pieces of information that come from widely available blood test results, like blood glucose values. So first of all, what we have to do, as we have seen, is to qualify the medical device software or the software itself to see if it's an IVD MDSV. So first, let's qualify it if it is an MDSV. Does it have a medical purpose? Yes, it does. Does it perform an action of data that is different than archival or simpler search? Yes. And is it for the benefit of individual patients? Yes. But now the question is the software an IVD? Because the data sources it collects come from different areas. So we qualify the software, and then we would be able to argue in this case that the main source of the data is blood test results, because these are 15 out of 32 variables. And if these values would have a higher significance in the assessment of the risk of cardiovascular artery disease than the data gathered by physical examination or by using medical devices, the IVD data sources could be considered to substantially drive the intended purpose of the software, and therefore this would be an in vitro diagnostic device, medical device software. This is how one would qualify whether a software product falls under the IVDR. And once this qualification is achieved, the next step would be the classification. So I want to look very briefly in the classification rules under the IVDR. What we have to understand before going into the classification rules is that all of these rules are governed by intended purpose, severity of disease, and risk for patient primarily. Again, as mentioned previously, software that drives or influences the use of the device falls in the same risk as the device, in the same risk class as the device, and whereas independent software is classified on its own. Very briefly through the classification rules. So rule 1 tells us that devices that are used for blood screening or for diagnosis or monitoring of high-risk diseases, especially those with a high risk of propagation, fall under Class D. Rule 2 deals with devices that are used for blood or tissue compatibility, which are generally classified under Class C, unless they identify markers of high-risk blood groups, in which they fall in Class D. Rule 3 mentions different types of situations in different types of devices that would be classified as Class C. It deals with devices that are used for diagnosis or monitoring of infectious diseases, cancer, companion diagnostic, or devices for congenital screening. The general assumption with Rule 3 and Class C devices is that they cover situations in which an erroneous result would have severe consequences for a patient, but the risk of propagation is reduced. So this is how Class C devices are generally separated from Class D devices. Under Class C, we also have devices for self-testing under Rule 4, and high-risk near-patient tests. Near-patient devices are also classified in their own right, but generally the high-risk ones are Class C. The devices for self-testing, they are generally Class C, but there is an exemption for devices that are used to support fertility monitoring, and there are other examples like devices for cholesterol monitoring or devices for analyzing urine samples. Rule 5 tells us that general IVDs like specific reagents, instruments, or specimen receptacles are classified under class A, the lowest risk class, and Rule 6 tells us that devices that do not fall under any of rules 1 to 5 are generally classified as class B. Also, class B are controls with no assigned values. So let's go into a few examples and see how these classification rules could be applied when it comes to software. And we would start with standalone software as an example. For this, I have taken a diagnostic software for genetic analysis. What I mean by this is that this would be a software that analyzes raw genetic data that comes from sequencing machines. And here, as I said, this really depends on the intended use of the analysis and of the software and of the severity of the disease. So if the genetic data that is analyzed would be of the transmissible agent, like of the bacteria of the virus, and if this transmissible agent would cause life-threatening disease with a suspected high risk of propagation, this device, the software, would fall under class D under Rule 1. If the genetic data would be of the transmissible agent, but it would not have a high suspected risk of propagation, but as I said, an erroneous result would cause death or severe inability to the individual, this software would classify under class C, under Rule 3. And in the third scenario, if the genetic data were of the patient, for example, if the software were used to determine the risk of hereditary disease, this would fall under Rule 3 and would be classified as a Class C device. As a next example, I have chosen embedded software. And here we could have, for example, software embedded in a home use fertility monitor. What the software would do, it would be embedded in a device that measures hormone levels to predict ovulation cycles. As I said, normally self-testing devices are classified under Class C, but since this impacts fertility testing, this would actually fall in the exception to Rule 4, and it would classify under Class B. Another example would be software embedded in a point of care, namely used by professional blood glucose analyzer. What the software would do, it would calculate blood glucose levels based on raw data from sensors in the device. And if the device provides essential information that is used to manage serious conditions like diabetes, this would also fall under Class C, under Rule 3. Again, these are very simple examples, but in real life, the softwares we deal with generally have multiple functionalities. For example, one could envision a software that has both diagnostic and data management functionalities, like a platform that would include a module for diagnostic analysis, like analyzing the patient's blood samples, one module for calculating the risk of cardiovascular artery disease, like we saw in the previous examples, and maybe another module for managing and reporting patient data. How would this look like? One could go about classifying each module on its own. So for example, diagnostic module might be classified as Class C or Class D for high-risk diagnostics. The cardiovascular artery disease calculation module would fall under Class B by applying Rule 6, whereas the data management component would not be considered an IVD because it would not have a medical purpose. If it's possible to separate the software into such modules, each functionality can be individually assessed and classified according to the applicable classification rules, which potentially leads to different classifications within the same software system. However, if it is not possible to separate the software into such clear modules, the higher risk class dictates the overall classification. So this is, in a nutshell, how one goes about classifying software products under the IVDR. And now I would like to go with you into the topic of changes and how they impact classification and what type of changes to software can impact a software's classification. And for this, I have prepared another mnemonic to illustrate this type of changes that can impact software classification under the IVDR. The mnemonic is very easy, it's IVDR. What I want to mention before I start going into the different aspects is that in most cases in practice, they are difficult to isolate. So, meaning all these aspects more often than not have to be assessed simultaneously when there is a software change, because they are all impacted to a certain degree. So what does IVDR stand for? I stands for the intended use. So if you have a change in the intended use of a device, of course, this can impact the classification. So for example, if you had a software that would initially be used just to record blood glucose levels, and the intended use of the software would be changed so that the software would also provide the patient's insulin dose recommendations. Such a change in intended use could lead to a different classification of the software. V stands for validation, specifically the need for revalidation. So whenever one expands the range of input variables to a software, this triggers a need for revalidation, and this could impact the classification. So if there were, for example, an expansion in the range of genetic markers that are used in the software to identify hereditary conditions. The D stands from diagnostic performance. So any increase or decrease in diagnostic performance should be assessed for its impact on classification. So two examples here. An allergy detection software that would initially be based on patient-reported symptoms and allergens panel, and would then be upgraded to include environmental factors and genetic data, and which would then lead to an increase in its diagnostic performance. This could trigger a change in the classification of the software. Another example, a software that analyzes bowel microbiome data. If initially the software just links profiles, user profiles to gastrointestinal issues, and the software is then upgraded or improved to also be able to include the risk of colon cancer, this would be an increase in diagnostic performance, and this could trigger the need for reclassification. And finally, and as I've said, these aspects cannot really be separated from each other, because an increase in diagnostic performance could trigger the need for revalidation and would implicitly mean a change in intended use. Of course, is the risk profile, and this is what the R stands for. Basically, every time, as you've seen in all of the previous examples on the slide, you change the risk profile of the device, you have to assess the impact on classification. Finally, I would like to discuss how these aspects like qualification, classification, and changes are relating to software that incorporates AI and ML models. So what the IVDR talks about mostly with regards to IVD and MDSV is, as we have seen, validation, risk management, post-market surveillance, provision of information to users, quality management systems, and technical file. So these are broadly the requirements of the IVDR for any product, but also for medical device software. The AI Act comes and on top of that and promotes and aims to regulate aspects related to human oversight and data quality and bias. The AI focus being really to be a global benchmark for AI and to include ethical considerations and control of our algorithms into the equation. So the AI comes and complements the IVDR by discussing and regulating aspects such as how to work with and how to document dynamic algorithms, transparency while the algorithms are running, explainability with regards to how the algorithms function, data quality and bias, as I mentioned, human oversight and reproducibility. So the two regulations complement each other while having a certain overlap, because the AI, of course, also deals with the topics that the IVDR raised in the first place. However, at the moment, when it comes to adaptive learning system, they are still not allowed in Europe. And what I mean by this is adaptive learning systems that change while running. So if you had such an AI ML containing model, it would still require under the European regulation an incremental implementation of the steps and basically an assessment of the changes with the IVDR mnemonic we discussed previously. So with this, I would like to end my talk and open the stage to questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a very, very good talk on IVDR. This is new land for me. I learned a lot today. We have a question here from Johnny, and he asks, for embedded software with multiple functions, you displayed some examples of that. When classifying the subject of software separation was mentioned, how do one determine if the software is enough separated to allow different classifications for the different components?
That's a very good question. So I think this goes hand in hand with the type of separation that one performs, like the type of separation into modules that one performs also under 62304 when one decides the software risk class and the amount of documentation required. I am not a software expert, so I don't really know how this is done in practice, but with respect to really programming. But if you can separate the modules when you put together the software, then you can have the different classifications.
Great, thank you, Johnny. Yeah, shout out to Johnny.
Similar to 62304.
Okay, and when you work with this topic in the market, what are the most common uncertainties in the market? What are the type of questions that you get the most?
I think one of the most common questions is whether the software falls under the in vitro diagnostic device regulation or not, or whether it falls under the medical device regulation. That's why I dwelled at the beginning a lot on qualification and what an in vitro diagnostic device actually is. So one always has to look at the type of data that the software deals with. And because a software is not an IVD in itself, usually the data comes from an IVD. And I think this is where a lot of the confusion comes from.
I can imagine. And when you work in the field with this and you talk to your clients, I assume that your clients set the classification fairly early in the development process. Yeah. Is that correct?
Yes. I mean, we usually start with the intended use document, with putting together an intended use document and a device description, a broad device description, for example, a map of the software, how it would look, what kind of modules it would have, what the intended purpose of the various modules would be. And then the next step is the classification, because that determines, of course, on the one hand, the amount of documentation you have to create for the software, but most importantly, also your conformity assessment pathway with the notified body.
Yeah, that sounds great. Are there any tips you have to our listeners here about any experiences that you've had with changes that have taken place to a software that had surprised the manufacturer that suddenly we didn't realize that this leads to a new classification?
I think the most surprising thing to manufacturers is the fact that almost every revalidation needs to be assessed in terms of classification as well. So, and every time you want to incorporate new variables or you want to retrain your algorithm with a new data set, this requirement for revalidation brings up questions of diagnostic performance. How does this impact the diagnostic performance? Is the software going to be better or worse at doing what it's doing? And then, of course, intended purpose and risk management. So, like the risk profile, because these are all linked. As I said, you can't really separate one. But I think the most challenging aspect is this revalidation.
I can imagine, because we all know that validations do take time to complete, and it can be very, very costly as well.
Yes, and then of course you have to look into analytical performance, clinical performance of the device every time you do this. And I think this is a bit underestimated by manufacturers.
Yes, and we see AI all over the place. I haven't seen a startup pitching a product for the last 12 months that doesn't contain AI. And I assume that's the same, a similar trend, I guess, for IVDR softwares. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, basically all the analysis of, not all, but let's say 90% of IVD analysis softwares now rely on AI for their output.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Anca. I hope I can invite you back, maybe to take a closer look next time on what kind of documentation do we need to supply in order to fulfill the AI Act on one hand, and of course, IVDR on the other hand. Thank you very much, Anca.
Thank you, Carl. It was a pleasure. Thank you.